His name was Kalen, and he was supposed to die. The last thing he remembered was running through the dark dust market, fleeing from Omega hunters when fire tore through the sky. But he awakened not in a grave, not in a trap, but in a stranger's body. In a spacious room with walls of bone, where the air smelled of sandalwood and smoke. In the mirror, a different face, a different body, and beside him stood a demon with ice-cold eyes who called him Laren. Kalen, once a simple herbalist and Omega from a broken clan, found himself in the body of Laren the Grey, heir to one of the most ruthless demon bloodlines. This was a world where love was a curse, where Omegas had no right to choose. They were rare, valuable, but also enslaved. Laren, whose body now housed Kalen's soul, was bound by a blood contract to Valmar, a werewolf alpha, warlord of the Northern Hills, fierce, silent, and deadly beautiful. Kalen remembered this Valmar from the prophetic book he had read before his death. In it, Laren died in battle through Valmar's betrayal. The memory whispered to him that Valmar had never loved him. But Kalen decided to change fate itself. The first days were pure torment. The body reacted to Valmar's scent, burned in the presence of the demon father, Mayros, who demanded obedience. Kalen didn't know how to behave like a noble Omega. He didn't restrain his gaze, didn't lower his head, didn't stay silent. When Valmar observed this change, he said, "You look at me as if you could bite." Kalen replied, "And you look at me as if you want me to break." Mayros forced Laren, or rather Kalen, to renew the pact of submission with Valmar. This was a magical agreement that prevented an Omega from escaping or resisting their alpha. But Kalen was not Laren. He tore the contract, burned it right at the ceremony. "I am not your dog, not your heir, not your doll," he declared. Mayros ordered Kalen to be disposed of. Valmar, to everyone's surprise, protected him, demonstrating his own will for the first time. As Kalen began to see the real Laren's memories, childhood in a cage, rituals of pain, screams of brothers sacrificed, he realized Laren hadn't been just a victim. He had been preparing to escape, and Kalen continued his path. Meanwhile, a strange tension appeared between him and Valmar. Not desire, but a hungry need to understand. Valmar confessed, "I was once an Omega, before my father put me through the transformation ritual. I was broken. You make me feel again." Attacks began. Someone was killing Omegas throughout the kingdom. An ancient prophecy spoke of an Omega who would break the seal and birth an era without chains. Kalen discovered that his soul hadn't accidentally ended up in this body. The real Laren had summoned the exchange, knowing he couldn't survive himself. Kalen could no longer separate himself from this life. The night before battle, Valmar touched Kalen's hand. "I don't know who you've become, but I know I want you to stay." Kalen responded, "You don't love me. You love the shadow of Laren that tormented you." Valmar replied, "But you're the one who made me feel that I'm not yet a beast, that I can still protect, not just break." They touched for the first time, not through instinct, but through pain and hope. After discovering the truth about the seal's nature, Kalen found the artifact of pure breaking, a dagger capable of severing any clan contract. But to use it required a sacrifice of the beloved. Mayros forced Kalen to choose. Either become an obedient Omega again or kill Valmar. Kalen cut himself instead. The seal disappeared. Clan magic fell. With castles destroyed and bloodlines dead, a new chance emerged. Kalen and Valmar left the capital. In an abandoned village by the Black Lake, they built a shelter for Omegas who had escaped their masters. "I could say I love you," Valmar whispered, "but I'd rather say I'm no longer afraid to live with you." Kalen smiled. "Then write a new story with me, without curses, without contracts." A year later, they walked to the lake shore, and Kalen gave Valmar a silver ring forged from fragments of the seal. "This isn't a promise. It's a choice. Every day, again." The book Kalen wrote for future generations was titled, "The One Who Refused to Be Someone Else's Choice." The transformation hadn't been gentle. When Kalen first opened his eyes in Laren's body, the disorientation was overwhelming. Every nerve felt foreign, Every breath carried sense his previous body had never known. The demon heritage that flowed through Laren's veins made everything sharper, more intense. Colors seemed to bleed at the edges. Sounds carried undertones that spoke of ancient magics, and the very air tasted of sulfur and starlight. Mayros, Laren's father, stood like a monolith of cruelty carved from shadow itself. His presence filled rooms with an oppressive weight that made even the strongest demons bow their heads. When he looked at Kaelin with those burning amber eyes, it was as if he could see straight through to the foreign soul inhabiting his son's body. "You seem different," he had said during their first encounter after Kaelin's awakening. "More defiant. I thought the fever had broken you further." Kaelin had learned to navigate these conversations carefully. Laren's memories provided glimpses of a life lived in constant fear, of a father who viewed his Omega son as nothing more than a political tool to be traded for power. But those memories were fragments, incomplete pieces of a puzzle that Kaelin was still trying to solve. He knew that one wrong word, one gesture too far from what Mayros expected, could mean death. The castle itself reflected the brutality of its masters. Corridors stretched endlessly, lined with portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow any who passed. The walls were adorned with weapons taken from defeated enemies, trophies that spoke of centuries of conquest and bloodshed. Servants moved through these halls like ghosts, their heads permanently bowed, their movements precise and fearful. Valmar's first visit after Kaelin's recovery had been a study in contained violence. The Alpha moved with the fluid grace of a predator, every step calculated, every gesture controlled. His silver hair caught the light like spun moonbeams, and his eyes held the cold beauty of winter storms. But beneath that controlled exterior, Kaelin sensed something else. A pain that matched his own, a loneliness that resonated with the isolation he had felt in his previous life. "The contract must be renewed," Valmar had said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "The old bonds have weakened during your illness." But when their eyes met, Kaelin saw a flicker of something that might have been hope. Or perhaps it was merely wishful thinking. The ceremony was to take place in the Hall of Binding, a vast chamber deep within the castle, where the air itself seemed thick with ancient magic. Generations of contracts had been forged here, Omega after Omega bound to their chosen alphas through rituals that stripped away choice and replaced it with magical compulsion. The walls were covered in symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed directly, and the floor was inlaid with silver that formed complex patterns designed to channel and focus magical energy. Kaelin had studied these patterns during the days leading up to the ceremony, using Laren's memories to understand their purpose. The Omega whose body he now inhabited had been far more intelligent than anyone had given him credit for. Hidden beneath layers of apparent submission, Laren had been planning his escape for years. He had memorized every symbol, understood every aspect of the magical bindings that held him. And now Kaelin had access to all of that knowledge. The night before the ceremony, Kaelin found himself unable to sleep. He stood at the window of his chamber, looking out over the landscape that stretched beyond the castle walls. The northern hills rose in the distance, their peaks shrouded in mist that never seemed to lift. Somewhere out there, in those wild places, there were others like him, Omegas who had escaped their bonds, who lived free despite the danger that freedom brought. Valmar appeared in the doorway like a specter, his presence announced only by the subtle shift in the air that came with his approach. "You're restless," he observed, moving to stand beside Kaelin at the window. "The ceremony troubles you." It wasn't a question. Alphas of Valmar's caliber could read the emotional states of Omegas with disturbing accuracy. "Would it trouble you?" Kaelin asked, turning to face the Alpha. "If you were about to be bound against your will to someone who saw you as nothing more than a tool?" The question hung between them like a challenge. In the old days, Laren would never have dared to speak so boldly. But Kaelin was not Laren, and he found himself unable to maintain the pretense of submission. Valmar's expression shifted, and for a moment, something raw and vulnerable flickered across his features. "I was bound once," he said quietly, "before the transformation ritual. I know what it feels like to have your choices stripped away." His hand moved to his chest, where Kalen could see the faint outline of scars through the thin fabric of his shirt. My father believed that strength could only come through suffering, that an Omega's gentleness was a weakness that needed to be burned away. The revelation struck Kalen like a physical blow. In all of Laren's memories, there had been no hint of this. Valmar had always been presented as the perfect alpha, born to dominance and power. But now, seeing the pain in those winterstorm eyes, Kalen understood that they were more alike than either had realized. The ritual changed you, Kalen said, and it wasn't a question. It made you into what you are now. Valmar nodded, his jaw tight with old pain. It took away my ability to feel the bond naturally, made me dependent on contracts and magic to maintain connections with others. I've been alone in my own body for decades. The ceremony began at dawn, as was tradition. The hall of binding filled with witnesses, demons and werewolves and other creatures of power who had come to observe the renewal of an important political alliance. Mayros stood at the center of the room, his presence dominating the space as he began the ritual incantations that would forge the new bonds. Kalen felt the magic building around him, pressing against his consciousness like a tide of molten metal. The symbols on the walls began to glow, their light pulsing in rhythm with the words being spoken. This was the moment of truth, the point where he would either submit to a fate that wasn't his or take a stand that might cost him everything. When Mayros called for him to approach the binding circle, Kalen moved forward with steady steps. The assembled witnesses watched in silence as he took his place across from Valmar. The Alpha's eyes were unreadable, but Kalen could sense the tension in his posture, the way his hands had clenched into fists at his sides. Do you, Laren of the Grey Line, accept the bonds of submission to Valmar of the Northern Hills? Maros's voice boomed through the hall, carrying the weight of centuries of tradition. Do you pledge your obedience, your body, and your essence to his will? Kalen looked around the hall, at the faces of those who had gathered to witness his binding. Then he turned his gaze to Valmar, seeing the Alpha's barely contained desperation. This was a man who had been broken by the same system that was now trying to break Kalen. A man who had been forced to become something he wasn't in order to survive. I do not accept, Kalen said, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. I reject these bonds. I reject this contract. I reject the notion that any being has the right to own another. The words seemed to echo in the vast chamber, bouncing off the walls and growing stronger with each repetition. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Gasps and shouts erupted from the assembled witnesses. Maros's face twisted with rage, his eyes blazing with fury that made the very air around him shimmer with heat. You dare to defy tradition? He roared. You dare to reject the bonds that have held our peoples together for generations? But Kalen was already moving, his hands tracing the symbols he had memorized from Laren's hidden studies. The magic that had been building for the binding ceremony suddenly reversed its flow, the energy that was meant to create chains instead becoming a force of liberation. The silver inlay on the floor began to crack, hairline fractures spreading outward from where Kalen stood. I am not your son, Kalen declared, his voice now carrying its own power. I am not your tool. I am not your possession. I am myself and I choose my own path. The contract that had been prepared for the ceremony burst into flames, the parchment consumed by fire that burned with all the colors of the rainbow. Mayros raised his hand, dark energy crackling around his fingers as he prepared to strike down the rebellious Omega. But Valmar moved faster, placing himself between Kalen and the Demon Lord. Enough, the Alpha said, his voice carrying an authority that rivaled Maros's own. The Omega has made his choice. I will not see him harmed for exercising his right to refuse. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything the castle had seen in centuries. Maros's rage was terrible to behold, his power lashing out in waves that shattered stone and melted metal. But Valmar stood firm, his own strength rising to meet the challenge. The two forces clashed in the center of the hall, magic and raw power colliding in displays that left the witnesses cowering in terror. In the end, it was Kalen who ended the battle. drawing on knowledge that came from both his own soul and Laren's memories. He reached out with his mind and touched the source of the castle's power. The ancient magics that had been bound into the very stones of the structure responded to his call, recognizing something in him that resonated with their original purpose. The castle itself seemed to sigh as centuries of accumulated dark energy began to dissipate. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on everyone within its walls lifted, replaced by something that felt almost like relief. Mayros staggered, his connection to the dark powers that had sustained him suddenly severed. "It's over," Kalen said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "The old ways are ended. The contracts are broken. Everyone here is free to choose their own path." As he spoke, the symbols on the walls began to fade, their power spent. The age of forced bonds was coming to an end. In the aftermath of the ceremony's destruction, the castle became a place of chaos and uncertainty. Some of the witnesses fled immediately, unwilling to remain in a place where the natural order had been so thoroughly overturned. Others stayed, curious to see what would emerge from the ruins of the old system. Kalen found himself at the center of it all, no longer the powerless Omega who had been brought here for binding, but something new and undefined. The magic that had broken the contracts still flowed through him, changing him in ways he didn't fully understand. His senses had sharpened even further, and he could feel the emotional states of everyone around him with startling clarity. Valmar approached him as the hall emptied, his expression unreadable. "You've destroyed everything," he said, but there was no anger in his voice. If anything, he sounded almost relieved. "The alliances, the contracts, the power structures that have existed for centuries. Do you understand what you've done?" "I've given everyone a choice," Kalen replied, "including you. You're no longer bound by the contracts your father forced on you. You're free to be whoever you choose to be." He reached out tentatively, his fingers brushing against Valmar's hand. "The question is, what will you choose?" The Alpha's response was to intertwine their fingers, his grip firm but gentle. "I choose to find out who I am without the chains," he said. "And I choose to discover that alongside you if you'll have me." The admission was quietly spoken, but Kalen could hear the weight of emotion behind it. Their escape from the castle came 3 days later, when the last of the old power structures finally collapsed. Mayros, stripped of his magical authority, had retreated to the deepest parts of the castle, raging impotently against the changes he couldn't reverse. The other demons of the Grey Line had scattered, some seeking new sources of power, others simply trying to survive in a world where the old certainties no longer applied. Kalen and Valmar left at dawn, taking only what they could carry. The road stretched before them, leading toward the northern hills and the wild places beyond. They had no clear destination, no plan beyond the simple desire to build something new and better than what they had left behind. As they walked, Kalen found himself thinking about the prophecy that had brought him to this place. The Omega who would break the seal and birth an era without chains. He had fulfilled that prophecy, but not in the way anyone had expected. The seal hadn't been some ancient magical artifact. It had been the system of contracts and forced bonds that had kept Omegas enslaved for generations. The journey to the northern hills took them through landscapes that seemed to shift and change as they traveled. The breaking of the contracts had affected more than just the immediate area around the castle. Magic itself was in flux, reality bending and reshaping as the old certainties dissolved. They encountered other travelers on the road, refugees from the changing world who were seeking safety and stability. Among them were other Omegas, individuals who had felt the moment of liberation when the contracts broke. Some had been bound to cruel masters, others had been living in hiding, afraid to claim their own power. Now they walked free, but freedom came with its own dangers. Without the protection of the old system, they were vulnerable to those who would seek to exploit them. It was Valmar who first suggested that they could offer protection to these refugees. "We have strength," he said as they made camp one evening, watching a group of young Omegas huddle together around their own fire. "We have knowledge. We could create a safe place for those who need it." The idea took root in Kalen's mind, growing stronger with each passing day. The abandoned village by the Black Lake became their destination almost by accident. They had been following rumors of a place where the old magic ran deep, where the changes in the world were less violent and chaotic. What they found was a settlement that had been empty for decades, its buildings intact but overgrown with vegetation that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. "This place feels different," Kalen said as they explored the empty streets. "The magic here is older, more stable. It's not fighting the changes like everywhere else." Valmar nodded, his enhanced senses picking up the same subtle energies that Kalen could feel. "It's like the magic here was waiting for something. For us, perhaps." They established their sanctuary in the largest building, a structure that had once served as a community center for the village's original inhabitants. Working together, they cleared out the debris and decay, their combined efforts breathing new life into the abandoned space. Other refugees began to arrive, drawn by word of mouth and the subtle magical emanations that seemed to promise safety. The community that grew around them was unlike anything that had existed before. Omegas who had never known freedom learned to make their own choices, to speak their own thoughts, to love whom they chose. Alphas who had been raised in the old ways of dominance and control learned new patterns of behavior, discovering that strength could come from protection rather than oppression. Kalen found himself taking on the role of teacher and counselor, helping newcomers adjust to their freedom while also learning to navigate his own transformed existence. The magic that had broken the contracts continued to flow through him, but it was changing, becoming something more nurturing and protective rather than destructive. Valmar's transformation was perhaps even more remarkable. The Alpha who had once been defined by his controlled violence and cold authority became someone who could offer comfort and support to those who needed it. His past as an Omega gave him unique insights into the struggles of those they were helping, while his strength as an Alpha provided the security that many needed to feel safe. Their relationship evolved slowly, built on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than magical compulsion. They spent their days working to build their community, and their evenings talking about their dreams for the future. The physical attraction that had been manipulated by the old contracts was replaced by something deeper and more genuine. The first time they made love, it was without ceremony or binding ritual. They came together in the quiet hours before dawn, driven by desire that was entirely their own. Kalen discovered that intimacy freely chosen was unlike anything he had experienced before. There was no sense of obligation or compulsion, only the simple joy of being with someone who saw him as an equal. Valmar's touch was gentle, almost reverent, as if he couldn't quite believe that this was real. "I never thought I would have this," he whispered against Kalen's skin. "Choice. Real choice." Kalen's response was to pull him closer, their bodies fitting together as if they had been made for each other. In the months that followed, their sanctuary grew into something approaching a small town. News of their success spread throughout the region, attracting not just refugees but also those who were curious about the new ways of living that were emerging. Merchants began to visit, bringing goods and news from the outside world. Scholars came to study the unique magical properties of their settlement. But growth brought new challenges. There were those who opposed the changes they represented, who saw the liberation of Omegas as a threat to the natural order. Attacks came sporadically, usually from groups of traditionalists who believed that the old ways could be restored through violence. Kalen and Valmar found themselves taking on the role of protectors as well as leaders. They trained the members of their community in self-defense, teaching them to work together to repel attacks. The magic that flowed through their settlement seemed to respond to their defensive efforts, creating barriers and warnings that helped keep their people safe. One of the most significant challenges came from an unexpected source. A group of demons claiming to be from the Grey Line arrived at their gates, demanding that Kalen return to fulfill his obligations as Laren's heir. They were led by a figure who introduced himself as Maroz's brother, a being of such dark power that his very presence seemed to drain the light from the air. "You cannot simply walk away from your bloodline," this new antagonist declared. "The contracts you broke were not merely personal agreements. They were part of a larger network of obligations that bind our peoples together. Your defiance has consequences that extend far beyond your own desires." The confrontation that followed tested everything that Kalen and Valmar had built together. The attacking demons brought with them magical weapons designed to compel obedience, artifacts that could override free will and force submission. But the community they had created was stronger than the sum of its parts. Omegas and Alphas fought side by side, their combined strength multiplied by the bonds of choice and mutual support. In the end, it was the unity of their community that won the day. The magic that had been used to break the original contracts had spread throughout their settlement, creating a field of liberation that neutralized the demons' compulsion magic. Faced with enemies they could not control, the attackers were forced to retreat. "This isn't over," Marrow's brother warned as he withdrew. "The old powers will not be denied forever. There are forces at work that you cannot comprehend, changes coming that will make your small rebellion seem insignificant." But his threats fell on deaf ears. The community had proven its strength, and its members were no longer afraid of the old ways. As winter approached, Kalen and Valmar made their relationship official with a ceremony that was entirely their own creation. There were no binding contracts, no magical compulsions, no obligations imposed by others. Instead, they exchanged vows of partnership and mutual support, promising to stand together as equals in whatever challenges lay ahead. The ceremony took place by the shore of the Black Lake, with the entire community gathered to witness their commitment. Kalen had forged rings from the remnants of the broken contracts, silver bands that had been purified of their compulsive magic and transformed into symbols of free choice. As they exchanged these rings, the very air seemed to shimmer with approval. "I choose you," Kalen said, his voice carrying across the water, "not because of magic or obligation or fate, but because of who you are and who you choose to be." Valmar's response was equally heartfelt. "I choose you because you showed me that strength comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. Because you taught me that love is about choice, not control." The celebration that followed lasted deep into the night, with music and dancing and stories shared around fires that burned with colors that had never been seen before. It was a celebration not just of their union, but of the new world they were helping to create. A world where love was freely given rather than magically compelled, where relationships were built on mutual respect rather than power dynamics. As the years passed, their community continued to grow and evolve. Children were born who had never known the old ways, who grew up taking freedom and choice for granted. These children, raised by parents who had chosen each other rather than being forced together, seemed to possess an inner strength and confidence that impressed all who met them. Kalen found himself taking on the role of chronicler as well as leader, documenting the changes they were witnessing and the lessons they were learning. His writings became the foundation for a new understanding of relationships and community, ideas that spread far beyond their small settlement. The book he eventually published, The One Who Refused to Be Someone Else's Choice, became a manifesto for the new age. It told the story of their journey from oppression to freedom, but more importantly, it provided a roadmap for others who wanted to build communities based on choice rather than compulsion. The final chapter of their story was written on the shore of the Black Lake, 10 years after their first meeting. Kalen and Valmar stood together, watching the sun set over the water, their hands intertwined. Around them, their community thrived, a testament to the power of choice and the strength that comes from unity. "Do you ever regret it?" Valmar asked, his voice soft in the evening air. "Giving up the power you could have had, the position you could have claimed?" Kalen smiled, his fingers tightening around his partner's hand. "I gave up nothing," he replied. "I gained everything. A family, a community, a love that was chosen rather than imposed. What more could anyone want?" As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, they made their way back to their home, surrounded by the sounds of a community at peace. Children played in the streets, their laughter echoing off the buildings. Adults gathered in small groups, sharing stories and making plans for the future. It was a scene of ordinary contentment, made extraordinary by the fact that it had been built on the foundation of radical choice. The legacy of their rebellion continued to spread, inspiring others to question the systems that had held them captive. The age of forced bonds was ending, replaced by something new and better. And at the heart of it all was the simple truth that Kalen had discovered in that moment of choice. That love, real love, could only exist when it was freely given and freely received. Their story became legend, passed down through generations as an example of what was possible when courage met compassion, when strength was used to protect rather than dominate, and when love was allowed to flourish without the chains of compulsion. It was a story of transformation, not just of individuals, but of an entire world learning to embrace the radical power of choice. In the end, the greatest magic was not the power to break contracts or destroy castles, but the ability to create something new from the ashes of the old. Something better, something kinder, something that honored the dignity and worth of every individual. And in that creation, Kalen and Valmar found not just love, but the true meaning of freedom. The years that followed their bonding ceremony brought challenges that tested their resolve in ways they had never imagined. The old powers, though weakened, had not disappeared entirely. They gathered in the shadows, plotting their return to dominance. Word reached the sanctuary that new alliances were forming among the traditional demon houses, werewolf clans, and other supernatural factions that had profited from the system of forced bonds. Kalen stood in the council chamber they had established in the heart of their settlement, studying reports that had come in from their network of allies and informants. The room itself was a symbol of their new way of governance, circular rather than hierarchical, with no throne or elevated position for any single leader. Decisions were made collectively, with every voice heard and considered. "The Crimson Covenant has been reformed," announced Lyra, a young Omega who had escaped from the Eastern Territories and now served as their chief intelligence gatherer. 3 demon houses, 5 werewolf clans, and at least 2 vampire covens have pledged to restore the old ways. They're calling it the Restoration. Valmar, who had been examining a map marked with reports of attacks on freed Omegas, looked up with concern. Their strategy seems to be targeting isolated communities first, places that can't defend themselves effectively. They're trying to prove that our model of governance is unstable, that freedom leads to chaos. The weight of leadership sat heavily on Kalen's shoulders. In the old world, he had been responsible only for himself. Now, hundreds of people looked to him for guidance and protection. The irony was not lost on him that in refusing to be owned by others, he had become bound by his own sense of responsibility to those who had chosen to follow him. "We need to reach out to the other free communities," he said, his voice carrying the authority he had never wanted but had learned to wield. "If they're going to target us one by one, we need to stand together. Isolation makes us vulnerable." The next months were spent building a network of communication and mutual support among the scattered communities of freed Omegas and sympathetic Alphas. Kalen found himself traveling extensively, sometimes with Valmar, sometimes alone, visiting settlements that had sprung up in the wake of their successful rebellion. Each community was unique, shaped by the particular needs and circumstances of its founders. Some were primarily focused on agriculture, creating sustainable food sources for their inhabitants. Others specialized in crafts and trade, their products sought after by those who valued the quality that came from work done freely rather than under compulsion. A few had become centers of learning, where scholars studied the new forms of magic that were emerging in the post-contract world. During one of these visits, to a community nestled in the mountains south of their own settlement, Kalen encountered someone who would change his understanding of his own transformation. The settlement was led by an ancient Omega named Theron, whose age was measured in centuries rather than decades. Unlike most Omegas, who appeared eternally young due to their magical nature, Theron showed the marks of his long life in the silver of his hair and the deep lines around his eyes. "I knew the original Laren," Theron said as they walked through his community's gardens, tended by children who had never known bondage. Not well, but well enough to recognize that what inhabits his body now is something entirely different. He stopped beside a fountain where water danced in patterns that defied gravity, a small miracle of liberated magic. "The question is, do you know what you really are?" The question haunted Kalen as he returned to his own settlement. He had assumed that his transformation was simply a matter of one soul replacing another, but Theron's words suggested something more complex. That night, he found himself in the small shrine they had built to honor those who had died in the struggle for freedom, seeking answers in the silence. Valmar found him there hours later, sitting in meditation before the memorial wall where the names of the fallen were inscribed in letters of light. "You're troubled," the Alpha observed, settling beside his partner with the easy familiarity of long companionship. "What did the old Omega tell you?" Kalen shared his conversation with Theron, the questions it had raised about his own nature. "What if I'm not really Kalen at all?" he asked. "What if I'm something else entirely, something created by the breaking of the contracts? What if the man you fell in love with doesn't actually exist?" Valmar's response was to take Kalen's hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "I fell in love with your choices," he said simply. "With your courage, your compassion, your determination to build something better. Those qualities don't depend on which soul originally created them. They exist in the here and now, in the person you choose to be every day." The wisdom in those words provided some comfort, but the questions remained. Kalen began to research the nature of soul transference, consulting with scholars and mystics who had studied the deepest mysteries of magical transformation. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he knew about identity and existence. The breaking of the contracts had released vast amounts of magical energy, energy that had been bound up in the system of force bonds for centuries. This energy had to go somewhere, and it had flowed into the cracks and spaces between worlds, creating new possibilities for existence. Kalen was not simply a transplanted soul, but something new, a being created from the fusion of two different forms of consciousness and shaped by the magical forces unleashed during the Great Breaking. "I am both and neither," he confided to Valmar one evening as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "I carry the memories of the herbalist who died in the market, but I also carry the hopes and dreams of the demon prince who was too broken to survive. And I am something more, something that was born from the collision of those two lives and the magic that surrounds us." This revelation brought a new understanding of his role in the changing world. He was not just a leader or a symbol of liberation, but a bridge between the old ways and the new, a living embodiment of the transformation that was sweeping through their reality. It was a responsibility that felt both overwhelming and strangely comforting. The Restoration Forces made their first major move in the third year after the Great Breaking. They struck simultaneously at 7 different free communities, overwhelming the defenders with coordinated attacks that showed careful planning and significant resources. The assault on Kalen's own settlement came at dawn, when the defenders were least prepared. The battle was fierce and chaotic, with magic and mundane weapons clashing in displays of power that shook the very foundations of the earth. Kalen found himself in the thick of the fighting, his transformed nature allowing him to channel energies that no ordinary Omega could access. He created barriers of solid light to protect the non-combatants, healed the wounded with touches that glowed with inner fire, and struck down attackers with bolts of pure force. But it was Valmar who turned the tide of battle. The Alpha had been holding back his true power for years, afraid that using it fully would awaken the beast that the transformation ritual had created within him. But when he saw Kalen surrounded by enemies, when he witnessed children cowering in fear, that restraint shattered. The transformation was terrible and beautiful to behold. Valmar's human form dissolved, replaced by something that was part wolf, part elemental force, part living manifestation of protective fury. His howl shook the heavens, and his claws rent through magical shields as if they were paper. The attacking forces, faced with a power they had not anticipated, broke and fled in terror. In the aftermath of the battle, as they tended to the wounded and counted their losses, Kalen found Valmar collapsed in the ruins of what had been their home. The Alpha had reverted to his human form, but the cost of the transformation was evident in his trembling hands and the exhaustion that seemed to weigh down his very soul. "I thought I had lost you," Valmar whispered as Kalen gathered him in his arms. "When I saw you surrounded, when I thought they might take you from me, I couldn't hold back anymore. The beast my father created, it wanted to protect you more than it wanted to destroy." Kalen held his partner close, feeling the rapid beat of his heart gradually slow to a normal rhythm. "We're both changed by this," he said softly. "The war has awakened things in us that we didn't know existed. But we're still us, still choosing to be together, still fighting for what we believe in. The victory came at a cost that extended beyond their immediate community. The display of power had attracted attention from forces that had previously remained neutral in the conflict between the old ways and the new. Ancient beings that had slept for millennia began to stir, drawn by the magical energies that had been unleashed. Some were benevolent, others decidedly less so. Among the first to make contact was a delegation from the Fey courts, beings of such alien beauty that looking at them directly was almost painful. Their leader, who introduced herself only as the Autumn Queen, spoke in words that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the mind. "The barriers between worlds grow thin," she said, her voice like the whisper of wind through dying leaves. "The magic you have unleashed spreads beyond your realm, affecting the balance of all existence. We come to offer alliance, but also to warn. There are those who would use this chaos to break down all boundaries, to merge all worlds into one endless battlefield." The implications of her words were staggering. Kalen had assumed that their rebellion was purely local, affecting only their immediate world. But the magic of the Great Breaking had reached into other dimensions, other realities, creating ripples that were still spreading outward. "What do you propose?" Kalen asked, his mind racing with the possibilities and dangers that the Autumn Queen's revelation presented. "How do we prevent this chaos you speak of?" The Fey Queen's smile was both beautiful and terrible. "You must learn to control what you have unleashed. The magic of freedom is powerful, but undirected power becomes destruction. You need teachers, guides who have walked the paths between worlds for longer than your species has existed." Thus began a new phase of their journey, one that took them far beyond the familiar boundaries of their own world. Kalen and Valmar, along with a small group of their most trusted allies, traveled to the Fey courts to learn about the deeper mysteries of magic and existence. The journey itself was transformative, taking them through landscapes that existed outside normal space and time. The Fey courts were unlike anything they had ever imagined. Palaces of crystallized music rose from gardens where flowers bloomed in colors that had no names. Time flowed differently in different areas, creating pockets where centuries passed in moments or where single heartbeats stretched into hours. The very air was alive with magic so pure and concentrated that it was almost overwhelming. Their training began immediately upon arrival. The Fae had their own understanding of power and responsibility, one that was far older and more complex than anything Kalen had encountered. They taught him to see magic not as a tool to be wielded, but as a living force that required respect and partnership. They showed him how to shape reality not through force, but through harmony and understanding. Valmar's education followed a different path. The Fae recognized the dual nature of his transformation, the way his artificial alpha nature was layered over his original omega essence. They taught him to integrate these aspects of himself, to find balance between the protective fury of the beast and the nurturing compassion of his original nature. The process was neither quick nor easy. Months passed in the Fey courts, months that translated to years in their home world due to the different flow of time. Kalen learned to weave magic like music, creating harmonies of power that could heal rifts between worlds. Valmar discovered that his greatest strength lay not in his ability to destroy, but in his capacity to stand as a guardian between different forms of existence. When they finally returned to their own world, they found it changed almost beyond recognition. The war between the old powers and the free communities had escalated into something approaching a magical apocalypse. Entire regions had been transformed into twisted landscapes where the laws of physics no longer applied. Refugees streamed across the continent, seeking safety from battles that left scars on reality itself. But there were also positive changes. The network of free communities had grown into something approaching a nation, with its own systems of governance and defense. New forms of art and literature had emerged, created by minds freed from the constraints of forced bonds. Children born in freedom were developing abilities that surpassed anything seen in previous generations. Kalen and Valmar threw themselves into the work of healing and reconstruction. Using the techniques they had learned from the Fae, they began to repair the damage caused by the magical warfare. Twisted landscapes were gradually restored to their natural state. Refugees were settled in new communities designed to be both beautiful and defensible. The network of free settlements was strengthened and expanded. The final confrontation with the Restoration Forces came 5 years after the Great Breaking, in a battle that would determine the future of their world. The old powers had gathered their remaining strength for one last assault, calling upon magics that had been forbidden for centuries. They summoned entities from the deepest hells, creatures of pure malevolence that sought only to destroy and consume. The battle was fought on multiple levels of reality simultaneously. In the physical world, armies clashed with weapons forged from starlight and nightmare. In the realm of magic, Kalen and other freed mages wove spells of protection and healing while their enemies sought to tear apart the very fabric of existence. In the spaces between worlds, Valmar and his fellow guardians stood watch, preventing the chaos from spreading to other dimensions. The turning point came when Kalen realized that the true enemy was not the Restoration Forces themselves, but the ancient magic that had corrupted them. The system of force bonds had not simply been a tool of oppression, but a manifestation of something far older and more malevolent. A parasitic entity that fed on suffering and control, growing stronger with each soul it enslaved. To defeat this entity, Kalen had to make the ultimate sacrifice. He opened himself completely to the magic of freedom, allowing it to flow through him without restraint or protection. The power was so intense that it began to burn away his physical form, but it also created a beacon of pure liberation that reached into every corner of their world. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The enslaved soldiers of the Restoration Forces found their minds suddenly clear, their choices restored to them. The summoned demons and hellspawn, no longer bound by the parasitic entity's will, fled back to their own dimensions. The ancient magic that had corrupted the system of bonds for millennia was finally purged from their reality. But the cost was nearly unbearable. Kalen's sacrifice had saved their world, but left him hovering on the edge of existence, his consciousness scattered across multiple dimensions. It was only Valmar's desperate love, the bond they had forged through choice rather than magic, that held him together long enough for the healing to begin. The restoration of Kalen's physical form took months, guided by the combined efforts of every healer in their network of communities. Valmar never left his side, pouring his own life force into the effort to bring his partner back from the brink of dissolution. When Kalen finally opened his eyes again, it was to find himself changed once more, transformed by his sacrifice into something that was both more and less than human. "I thought I had lost you," Valmar whispered, his voice hoarse from weeks of grief and desperate hope. "I thought the magic had taken you away from me forever." Kalen's response was to reach up and touch his partner's face, marveling at the simple miracle of physical sensation. "I am here," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond the physical. "Changed, but still here. Still choosing you, still choosing us." The love in his eyes was unchanged, despite everything he had been through. The victory over the Restoration Forces marked the beginning of a new age, one where the principles of freedom and choice were no longer revolutionary ideas but accepted reality. The network of free communities evolved into a confederation of independent settlements, each maintaining its own character while contributing to the greater whole. Trade and cultural exchange flourished, creating a renaissance of art, science, and magical innovation. Kalen and Valmar found their roles changing as well. No longer needed as military leaders or revolutionary figures, they became teachers and guides, helping others navigate the complexities of life in a world where freedom was both a gift and a responsibility. They established schools where young people could learn to use their abilities safely, courts where disputes could be resolved through dialogue rather than force, and sanctuaries where those who had been damaged by the old system could find healing. Their own relationship continued to deepen and evolve. The trials they had faced together had forged bonds that went beyond the physical or even the magical. They had become true partners in every sense of the word, each complementing the other's strengths and supporting their weaknesses. Their love had become a foundation not just for their own happiness, but for the entire civilization they had helped create. The children born in this new world were remarkable in ways that their parents could barely comprehend. Freed from the constraints of forced bonds and artificial hierarchies, They developed abilities that transcended traditional categories. Some could communicate with animals, others could manipulate matter at the molecular level, and a few seemed to exist partially in multiple dimensions simultaneously. One of these children, a young Omega named Aster who had been born in their original settlement, showed particular promise. From an early age, he demonstrated the ability to see and interact with the magical currents that flowed through their world. Under Kalen's guidance, he learned to use this gift not for personal gain, but for the benefit of the entire community. "He reminds me of you," Valmar observed one evening as they watched Aster teaching a group of younger children how to sense the emotional states of plants. The same determination to use power responsibly, the same instinct to protect rather than dominate. Kalen smiled, seeing in the young Omega's work a vindication of everything they had fought for. "He's what we were trying to create," he said. "A generation that takes freedom for granted, that sees cooperation as natural and domination as aberrant. He's the future we were building toward." As the years passed, their world became a beacon of hope for other realities struggling with similar issues. Delegations arrived from dimensions where slavery was still legal, where the strong still preyed upon the weak without consequence. Some came seeking military aid, others wanted to learn about their methods of governance and social organization. Each visitor was welcomed and taught according to their needs and their capacity to learn. Some returned to their own worlds as revolutionaries, spreading the ideals of freedom and choice. Others chose to remain, adding their own perspectives and abilities to the growing tapestry of their civilization. The transformation of their world was not without its challenges. Freedom, they discovered, was not a destination but a journey, one that required constant vigilance and renewal. New forms of oppression emerged, more subtle than the old contracts but potentially just as dangerous. Some communities struggled with the transition from external control to self-governance, while others faced the challenge of maintaining their ideals in the face of material prosperity. Kalen and Valmar found themselves called upon repeatedly to help resolve these issues, their experience and wisdom making them valuable mediators and counselors. They traveled extensively, visiting communities that were struggling with the complexities of freedom, offering guidance and support while being careful not to impose their own solutions. One of their most significant interventions came when a community in the far north began to slide back toward the old ways. A charismatic alpha named Darius had convinced a group of Omegas that they would be happier and safer if they voluntarily accepted bonds of service. The situation was complicated by the fact that the Omegas in question genuinely seemed to prefer the structure and security that submission provided. "We cannot force people to be free," Kalen said during the long discussions that preceded their intervention. "If they truly choose bondage, then preventing that choice would be just another form of oppression." But Valmar was less certain. "Can a choice made from fear truly be called free?" he asked. "These Omegas have been conditioned by centuries of oppression to believe that they are incapable of independent existence. How do we distinguish between genuine preference and internalized servitude?" The solution they eventually devised was both elegant and complex. Rather than forbidding the bonds outright, they established a system of safeguards and alternatives. Any Omega who chose to enter into service could do so, but only after a waiting period during which they would receive counseling and education about other options. The bonds themselves were limited in duration and scope, with regular reviews to ensure that they remained truly consensual. More importantly, they created alternative structures that could provide the security and guidance that some Omegas craved without requiring submission. Mentorship programs, communal living arrangements, and cooperative work projects all offered ways for individuals to feel supported and valued without sacrificing their autonomy. The success of this approach led to its adoption throughout their confederation, creating a model for addressing similar issues in other communities. It was a reminder that freedom was not a simple concept, but a complex balance of individual choice, social responsibility, and mutual support. As their civilization matured, Kalen and Valmar found themselves taking on increasingly ceremonial roles. They were honored as founders and liberators, their story told and retold in countless variations. Statues were erected in their honor, holidays were declared to commemorate their achievements, and their names became synonymous with the ideals of freedom and choice. but they remained fundamentally unchanged by the adulation. They continued to live simply, to work for the common good, and to find their greatest joy in each other's company. Their love had become legendary, a symbol of what was possible when two people chose each other freely and completely. The final chapter of their public life came when they were invited to participate in the first Interdimensional Congress, a gathering of representatives from multiple realities who had come together to address common challenges. The Congress was held in a specially constructed space that existed between worlds, allowing beings from incompatible dimensions to interact safely. Kalen and Valmar were asked to speak about their experiences, to share the lessons they had learned about building free societies. Their presentation was simple and direct, focusing not on the dramatic battles they had fought, but on the quiet work of daily choice and mutual support that had made their transformation possible. Freedom is not a gift that can be given, Kalen told the assembled delegates. It is a practice that must be renewed every day, in every interaction, through every choice we make. It requires courage, compassion, and the willingness to see others as equals deserving of respect and dignity. Valmar's contribution was equally profound. Love is the foundation of all freedom, he said. Not the possessive love that seeks to control and dominate, but the liberating love that encourages growth and choice. When we love someone, we want them to be their truest self, not the person we think they should be. The Congress voted to establish a permanent council dedicated to promoting freedom and choice across the dimensions, with Kalen and Valmar as its first co-chairs. It was an honor they accepted with mixed feelings, knowing that it would require them to spend much of their time away from the world they had helped create. But they also recognized the importance of the work. The forces of oppression were not limited to any single reality, and the fight for freedom was one that needed to be waged on multiple fronts. By sharing their knowledge and experience, they could help others avoid the mistakes and tragedies that had marked their own journey. Their final years were spent in service to this greater cause, traveling between worlds and dimensions, teaching and learning, helping to build a network of free societies that span the multiverse. It was exhausting work, but deeply fulfilling, knowing that their efforts were helping to create a future where freedom was not the exception but the norm. When they finally retired from public life, they returned to their original settlement by the Black Lake, now grown into a thriving city that was home to hundreds of thousands of people from dozens of different species and dimensions. They built a small house on the shore, where they could watch the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson, just as they had done so many years before. Their last years together were marked by a peace and contentment that they had never dared to hope for in their youth. They tended a garden where flowers from a dozen different worlds bloomed side by side, wrote memoirs that would become essential reading for future generations, and most importantly, simply enjoyed each other's company. The end, when it came, was as gentle as their love had been profound. They passed within hours of each other, their bodies finally succumbing to the accumulated effects of the magical transformations they had undergone. But even in death, their bond remained unbroken, their consciousness merging into something that transcended individual existence. Their legacy lived on in the civilization they had helped create, in the principles they had championed, and in the countless lives they had touched. The world they left behind was not perfect, but it was free, and that freedom was their greatest gift to the future. In the end, they had achieved something that had once seemed impossible. They had proven that love, freely given and freely received, was indeed the most powerful force in the universe.